silent rancher hadn't talked to women in years. Until 3 Apache women collapsed at his door, John had lived alone for many years. His small ranch sat far from any town, hidden among the dry hills and dusty plains of Arizona. The wind swept constantly across the land, carrying the smell of earth and dry grass, and at night the stars were so bright it felt like the whole sky belonged only to him. John liked it that way. He had grown used to silence, to the quiet rhythm of his life, and he liked the way his work in the land kept him busy from sunrise to sunset. Every morning he woke early. Before the sun was fully up, he would pull on his worn boots and step outside. The cool air of dawn brushed his face, and he would breathe deeply, letting the stillness of the desert fill him. There was a kind of peace in the routine, the sound of horses moving in their stalls, the clatter of buckets, and the occasional crow of a rooster somewhere on the horizon. John rarely saw anyone, and he liked it that way. He had friends long ago, but life had led him here, to quiet, to solitude, and he had learned to enjoy it. His ranch was not large, but it was enough.
A small farmhouse stood in the middle of the property, surrounded by fences that kept his animals in and the desert out. He had cows, a few horses, and some chickens. Each had its place, and John knew them well. He could tell which horse was happy, which cow was sick, and which chicken was about to lay an egg.
Animals, he thought, were easier to understand than people. They did not speak in confusing ways, they did not judge, and they did not ask questions that made him uncomfortable. Over the years, John had grown quiet. He spoke very little to neighbors because the few times he tried, he realized he didn't have much to say. Small talk had never been his strength, and after living alone for so long, he found that words often felt unnecessary. He communicated more with actions than speech. If a fence needed fixing, he fixed it.
If the animals were thirsty, he gave them water. His life was simple, but it was his, and that simplicity suited him. Despite the peace, the solitude was not always easy. Sometimes the evenings were long and empty.
He would sit on the porch, staring at the fading light across the hills, and he would feel the quiet pressing in. At those times, memories of the past would come to him, his family, old friends, and a life that had once been fuller of voices and laughter. But he didn't let himself dwell. He would light the old kerosene lamp in the kitchen, make a simple dinner, and turn his mind back to what was in front of him. The animals, the land, the work that needed to be done. John had a routine for everything: morning chores, afternoon repairs, and evenings spent reading old letters or listening to a small radio he had kept from younger days. He loved the quiet so much that it became a friend. He could hear the wind whisper through the dry grass, and it seemed to tell him stories of its own. He could hear the soft hooves of his horse on the dirt path and feel a strange sense of companionship from the rhythm. These sounds, small as they were, made him feel connected to the world without needing to speak to anyone.
The land itself had its own rhythm. Rain came rarely, but when it did, it turned the dusty soil into a dark, rich color, and the plants would suddenly look alive.
The seasons changed, and John knew each one well. He could sense the coming of winter when the nights grew colder and the desert air smelled sharper. He could sense the heat of summer approaching when the ground began to shimmer in the sunlight and the animals sought shade earlier in the day. The land was alive in its own quiet way, and John felt part of it, even if he was alone.
There were stories in the wind in the hills, too.
Sometimes he would find a rattlesnake curled near the fence, reminding him of the dangers that lived with him. Sometimes he would see tracks of animals that had wandered close to the water trough, and he would study them, trying to understand what had passed through. Life in the desert was full of small challenges, and John took them seriously. Every day required attention, care, and respect. He had learned the hard way that ignoring even small details could have serious consequences, whether it was a broken fence letting a cow escape or a sudden storm flooding a low area. John did not regret his life. He did not wish for crowds or endless conversations. Yet deep down there was a part of him that remembered what it had been like to be around others. He remembered laughter, the warmth of company, the small moments of connection that were now distant memories. But those feelings were quiet, like a soft echo in the back of his mind, easily drowned out by the demands of daily life. The land kept him busy enough that there was little room for longing. Even so, there were occasional visitors. Neighbors from miles away who would ride over on rare occasions. They would wave from their horses, exchange a few words, and leave. John appreciated their presence but never felt the need to keep them around. He had built his world carefully, and it was a world where he felt safe and in control. People, unpredictable as they were, could disrupt that balance, and he had learned to keep them at a distance. Some evenings, John would walk out into the open fields and just stand there. The horizon stretched endlessly, painted with colors that changed every moment as the sun sank lower. He would breathe in the dry air, listening to the soft rustle of grass and the distant calls of birds returning to their nests. In those moments he felt the weight of solitude, but it was not always unpleasant. Sometimes it was a reminder of his own strength, his ability to survive and thrive alone. Life had taught John patience. He had learned to wait, to notice small changes, and to appreciate the quiet victories of everyday survival. Every repaired fence, every well-fed animal, every sunset he witnessed alone was a mark of his persistence. The desert did not rush him, and he did not rush the desert. They moved together at a steady, deliberate pace, and that pace suited him perfectly. By the end of the day, John would return to his house. The porch would be bathed in the soft glow of twilight, and he would sit in his old rocking chair looking at the vast open land before him. It was in those quiet hours that he reflected on his life, not with regret, but with acceptance. He had chosen this path, and though it was lonely, it was honest and real. He had built something that belonged entirely to him, a life of work, solitude, and careful observation. The night would fall, and the stars would appear, one by one, like tiny lamps scattered across the sky. John would sit for hours, feeling the cool desert breeze on his face, listening to the soft sounds of the night and thinking about the days to come. There was comfort in the consistency of it all, the work, the animals, the land, and the silence that wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. In this quiet life, John had become part of the land itself. The desert shaped him, taught him, and, in a way, protected him. He rarely spoke, rarely ventured beyond the boundaries of his ranch, and rarely allowed anyone close. And yet, there was a strength in that solitude, a careful balance of independence, survival, and quiet reflection that made him who he was, a man shaped by the land, by his choices, and by years of living quietly, alone, but fully alive. John was finishing the morning chores when he first noticed something unusual. The sun had barely risen, and the desert was already warm, the air carrying that familiar, dry, dusty scent he had grown so used to. He had been mending a section of fence near the edge of his property, hammering in posts and tying the wire tightly, when he heard a sound that made him pause. At first, he thought it was the wind, but it was different, something irregular, urgent, a soft thump, followed by a shuffle. He wiped the sweat from his brow and set down the hammer, squinting across the open land. The horizon stretched endlessly, golden under the rising sun. But something was moving near the porch of his house. At first, he couldn't make it out. Then he saw them. 3 figures lying on the ground, motionless. His heart skipped a beat. Visitors were rare, strangers even rarer. And 3 women collapsed. In the middle of the desert was something he had never imagined. John's first instinct was caution. He had lived alone for years, and strangers could bring trouble. But the sight of them, pale, thin, and trembling, ignited something he had not felt in a long time. Concern. He dropped the fence tools and ran toward them, each step kicking up small clouds of dust. As he got closer, he could see their faces. Eyes closed, mouths dry, and hair sticking to their sweaty foreheads. They were young, perhaps in their 20s, and their skin glistened from heat and exhaustion. "Hey! Are you all right?" John called, his voice rough from disuse. The sound of it startled him as much as it did them. One of the women stirred slightly, coughing, and another groaned. The third remained still. John felt a surge of urgency. Without thinking, he grabbed the nearest blanket from the porch swing and laid it on the ground. He carefully dragged the women onto it, one by one, trying not to hurt them. The sun was rising higher now, and its heat pressed down hard on the land. John fetched water from the well, filling every available cup and bowl. He crouched beside them, offering the water slowly, trying not to overwhelm them. The first woman managed a small sip and whispered something he couldn't understand. The second coughed harshly but took the water as well. The third opened her eyes finally, weak and wary. John noticed the fear in them. They did not know him, they did not know this land, and yet here he was, a stranger in his own quiet life, offering them care. He felt something strange stir inside him. It had been years since he had interacted with women, or even strangers so closely. His life had been a quiet one, filled with the rhythm of work and animals, with little human contact beyond a wave to a distant neighbor. And now, in a single moment, that silence was broken. The desert had thrown them onto his doorstep, and he had no choice but to respond. The women's story came slowly, in broken sentences and gestures. They were traveling across the desert when a sudden sandstorm had hit. The wind had whipped against them with blinding force, and they had fallen, unable to continue. One by one they had lost strength, collapsing where the desert had claimed a quiet corner for them. John listened as best he could, nodding, offering water, and guiding them inside the house. Every step he took, every action felt foreign. He was not used to caring for people in this way, but instinct had taken over. Inside the house, he guided them to the living room, laying them gently on the couch and chairs. He offered them towels to wipe their sweat, a basin of water to wash their faces, and even blankets to cover their trembling bodies. The women looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. They were wary, but they trusted him enough to accept the care. John, for his part, felt a strange warmth he hadn't felt in years. It was not just relief that they were alive. It was the realization that human connection could still exist, even in the middle of his isolated world. John moved around the house almost instinctively. He prepared a simple meal, bread, cheese, and some boiled eggs, placing it carefully in front of the women. He spoke little, but his actions communicated his intent. The women ate slowly, still weak, and John watched them quietly. He had not realized how much he had missed being around people. Their presence, their voices, even their soft movements were a stark contrast to the silence that had defined his life. He felt a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. At one point, one of the women attempted to stand, but her legs wobbled dangerously. John caught her, steadying her with strong, careful hands. "Take it slow," he said, his voice low but firm. She nodded, embarrassed, and sat back down. The other two watched, silent, and he realized that trust was not given easily. They had survived the desert, a harsh and unforgiving land, and yet here they were, relying on a stranger. That thought struck him deeply. These women were strong, resilient, and brave, and somehow he was responsible for their immediate safety. Hours passed, and slowly the women regained their strength. John continued to check on them, offering water and small bites of food, adjusting blankets, and ensuring the room stayed cool. The desert outside roared with heat, but inside there was a calm he had never experienced before. The women spoke in their language occasionally, softly, to each other, and he listened without understanding every word. The sound of it, however, was comforting, almost musical in its rhythm. It reminded him that the world was larger than his quiet ranch, larger than the solitude he had embraced. John began to learn small details about them. They were sisters, traveling together, and had been on their way to visit family. The desert had taken them by surprise, as it often did, and they had been unprepared for the strength of the storm. John noted their resilience. Despite the collapse, they had survived. That resilience impressed him, and he felt a budding respect for these strangers who had stumbled into his life so abruptly. By late afternoon, the women were sitting up more steadily, talking in soft tones, laughing quietly at small jokes, and beginning to regain their confidence. John watched from a distance, giving them space, though he felt a strange desire to speak, to connect. He realized that he had been silent not because he disliked people, but because he had been afraid of the unpredictability, of the needs, of the closeness that came with human interaction. And yet the desert had forced him into this closeness, and he had survived it, and so had they. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the desert with long shadows and golden light, John reflected on the day. His quiet life had been disrupted, but not in a way that caused harm. Instead, it had reminded him of a truth he had nearly forgotten. Life, no matter how carefully managed, could bring unexpected challenges and unexpected joys. The women, weak but recovering, were proof of that. They had arrived at his door by chance, but they had awakened something in him that years of solitude had kept dormant. When night fell, John prepared beds for the women in the spare rooms. He placed water and blankets at their sides, checking that each one was comfortable before leaving them. The house was quiet now, the women asleep, but the silence was different from before. It was no longer just the stillness of a man alone. It was the quiet after care, after connection, after a day of shared survival. John sat on his porch, staring at the stars above, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The desert was the same as always, vast and empty, but the world inside his house had changed forever. John knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges. He would have to feed the women, help them regain strength, and figure out how to guide them safely on their journey. But he no longer feared these challenges in the way he once might have. He had learned, in just one day, that human connection, even sudden and unexpected, could be a source of strength, not weakness. And for the first time in many years, he felt a flicker of excitement at what the next day might bring. For all his years of living alone, John realized that life could still surprise him. The three women, fragile and strong at the same time, had entered his world like a sudden storm, and yet they had brought a strange warmth, a reminder that even in the quietest lives, change could arrive, and it could be good. He watched the desert night stretch out before him, the stars blinking patiently, and for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to meet the unknown, whatever it might bring. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over John's ranch, casting a warm, golden light across the dry land. John woke early, as always, moving quietly so as not to disturb the women. They were still sleeping, their bodies tired from the previous day's ordeal. He could see that they had slept longer than usual, which was a good sign. Slowly, he prepared a simple breakfast: eggs, bread, and some fresh water, placing it carefully on a tray to take to them. As he entered the room, he saw the first signs of life. One of the women was sitting up, brushing her hair back from her face. Her eyes met his briefly, and she gave a small, shy smile. Another stirred, stretching her arms, while the third remained curled under the blanket, her breathing deep but steady. John set the tray down near the women and stepped back. He did not speak much. Words felt awkward in this new situation. His actions, however, were careful and deliberate, showing concern and respect. The women began eating slowly, their movements still a little weak, but steadier than the day before. John watched them, making sure they drank enough water and were comfortable. He felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that they were recovering, admiration for their resilience, and a quiet awe at their presence in his home. It was strange for him, after so many years of silence, to feel this kind of connection, even if it was unspoken. After breakfast, John suggested they move outside. The desert was already warm, but the morning air was pleasant, and sunlight touched the hills gently. He guided the women to the porch, helping them stand and walk carefully. At first, their steps were unsteady, but as they moved across the wooden boards of the porch, they began to regain confidence. John stayed close, quietly observing, ready to support them if needed. Once outside, the women began to explore their surroundings. Their eyes widened as they took in the ranch, the animals grazing peacefully, the wide-open fields, and the mountains rising in the distance. John explained briefly about the animals, showing them which horses were his and which cows were hers. He could see their curiosity growing, and he realized that for the first time in many years, he was not alone in appreciating the beauty of his land. The women started asking small questions, their voices tentative but growing stronger. One asked about the fences, another about the well, and the third about the chickens. John answered as best he could, using gestures when words failed. He noticed that communication was slow at first, but it improved with patience and attention. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of shared understanding, not just survival, but learning and curiosity together. As the day progressed, John helped them with small tasks around the ranch, He showed them how to fetch water from the well, how to feed the animals, and even how to check the fences for damage. The women were eager to help, not just to regain their strength, but also to contribute to the rhythm of life on the ranch. They were careful, attentive, and surprisingly quick learners. He realized that survival had made them resourceful, and their presence was slowly transforming the ranch from a place of solitude into a place of life and activity. During the afternoon, they rested under the shade of the porch, sharing water and light conversation. John learned a little about their journey. They were sisters, traveling to visit family, and had underestimated the harshness of the desert. They told stories of their home, their parents, and the small village where they had grown up. John listened carefully, asking questions sparingly, feeling the weight of their experiences and the depth of their bond. He felt honored that they shared their story with him, a man who had lived alone for so long. The women also learned from John. They asked about the desert, the animals, and the ranching life he had built over the years. John explained patiently, sometimes showing them through action rather than words. He demonstrated how to mend a fence post, how to check a horse's hooves, and how to ensure the cows had enough water. The women watched carefully, absorbing every detail, and occasionally trying tasks themselves. John encouraged them, correcting gently when needed, but always with respect. By late afternoon, John noticed a change in the women. They were more relaxed, moving with steadier steps and laughing quietly at small shared jokes. The fear that had been in their eyes the day before had softened into trust. John felt a strange warmth at this sight, the recognition that they were beginning to feel safe. He realized that trust could grow quickly when nurtured carefully, even in the harshest of places. That evening, John prepared another simple meal. They ate together, sitting around the kitchen table, and for the first time, John spoke more than a few words. He asked about their family, about their travels, and about the desert they had crossed. They responded with smiles and soft words, their voices carrying a new confidence. It was a small, quiet communion, but for John it felt significant. He had not shared a meal with others in years, and the act of being together, of supporting one another, was profoundly moving. After dinner, they went outside again. The desert was cool now, the heat of the day giving way to the soft chill of evening. John guided them to a small hill near the ranch where they could see the entire valley spread out below. The women sat quietly, taking in the view, and John felt the bond between them deepen. Words were not always necessary. The shared silence, the shared survival, and the simple presence of each other created a connection that felt real and lasting. As night fell, John helped them settle into the spare rooms again. He checked on each of them, making sure they had water and blankets, and then returned to his own space. The house was quiet, but the quiet was no longer the same as before. It was different. It was filled with a memory of shared effort, trust, and connection. John sat on the porch, staring at the stars, reflecting on the day. He realized that life had shifted not because of anything he had planned, but because the desert had brought these women into his life. John thought about his own past, the years of solitude, the fear of letting anyone close, and the routines that had defined his life. He understood now that solitude had been safe, but it had also been limiting. By helping these women, by opening his home and heart to them, he had begun to rediscover a part of himself that he had long forgotten, the capacity for empathy, connection, and joy in shared experience. The women, too, were learning from John. They had experienced hardship in the desert, but they were gaining strength, resilience, and trust. They were beginning to see that the ranch, though isolated, was a place of safety and care. John had offered them not just shelter, but patience, respect, and kindness, a rare gift in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. Days passed in this rhythm. Each morning, John guided the women through chores and tasks. Each afternoon, they explored the ranch and shared stories. Each evening, they ate together, spoke quietly, and watched the stars. Slowly, the fear that had once been so strong in the women's eyes faded, replaced by curiosity, confidence, and respect. And for John, the walls he had built around himself began to soften. He realized that life, even in solitude, could be richer when shared, even in small ways. By the end of the week, the women were strong enough to help more actively around the ranch. They carried water, fed the animals, and even began assisting with small repairs. John watched them with quiet pride, noting how quickly they had adapted to the demands of desert life. He also noticed how his own perspective had shifted. He no longer viewed the women as fragile strangers, but as capable, resourceful, and brave individuals.
In these days of shared work and quiet conversation, a bond had formed between John and the women. It was not a loud, dramatic connection, but a subtle, steady one built on trust, care, and mutual respect.
The ranch, once a place of solitude and silence, had become a place of shared life, small joys, and quiet companionship. John felt a warmth in his chest, a realization that the desert, though harsh, had brought him something he had long thought lost: connection, purpose, and the gentle rediscovery of human kindness. As night fell once more, John helped the women prepare for bed. They were tired but content. They had shared stories, learned new skills, and felt the comfort of safety. John sat on the porch afterward, listening to the soft sounds of the desert night. For the first time in many years, he did not feel the weight of isolation. Instead, he felt the quiet strength of companionship, the gentle joy of shared life, and the anticipation of what the next day might bring. For John, the arrival of these three women had changed everything. His quiet ranch, once a place of solitude, was now filled with life, trust, and connection. And though the desert remained harsh and unforgiving outside, inside something new had grown, a small, steady hope that life could be shared, even in the most unexpected ways.
By the fourth day, the rhythm of life on John's ranch had settled into a gentle, shared routine. The women were now strong and confident, moving easily through chores and exploring the land with curiosity.
John, who had once been silent and isolated, found himself talking more, teaching them about the ranch, the animals, and the land he had cared for all his life. The house, once quiet and empty, was now alive with activity, conversation, and laughter.
Each morning began with the usual chores. John would wake early and check the animals, ensuring they were fed and watered.
The women would rise soon after, helping him gather eggs from the chicken coop or refill water troughs for the horses and cows. Their movements were careful but steady, and John noticed how quickly they had learned to read the land, the subtle signs of approaching weather, the small details that indicated a horse needed attention, or which plants were safe to touch.
Their intelligence and adaptability impressed him, reminding him that strength comes in many forms. As they worked together, the women began to share more of their own traditions and stories.
They spoke of their Apache heritage, the values of their families, and the lessons they had learned from the land they called home. John listened, fascinated.
He had always respected life in the desert, but their stories brought a new perspective, one of harmony with nature, of understanding the land not just as a place to survive, but as a living entity to honor.
The women explained the significance of the plants, the seasons, and even the animals, teaching John to see his own ranch in a new light. John, in turn, taught them practical skills. He showed them how to mend fences with care, how to tend to sick animals, and how to manage the small daily tasks that kept the ranch running smoothly. He explained the patterns of the weather, the signs of a coming storm, and the importance of patience and observation. The women absorbed everything eagerly, asking questions, experimenting, and even offering their own ideas. John realized that teaching them was not just a task, it was a way of connecting, of exchanging knowledge, and of forming a bridge between their worlds. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, John took a break and watched the women work in the yard. One of them was carefully examining a small injured bird they had found near the fence. Another was checking the water troughs, ensuring the animals had enough, while the third was gathering some dry wood for the evening fire. John felt a sense of pride and quiet admiration. They were no longer strangers in need of help. They were partners in survival, participants in the life of the ranch, and friends in ways he had never anticipated. The women's laughter began to fill the spaces between the chores. They joked with each other in their language, sometimes translating words for John. The sound was lively and musical, and John found himself smiling more than he had in years. The desert, which had once been so quiet, now seemed to hum with life. He realized that these moments, small, ordinary, and shared, were teaching him as much about humanity as any lesson he had learned in solitude. He began to understand the joy of connection, the strength of kindness, and the subtle power of trust. During the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills.
The women shared stories of their family, of childhood memories, and of life in their village. John listened intently, asking questions and sometimes offering his own experiences from his years on the ranch.
It was a slow, careful exchange of knowledge and understanding, each learning from the other. John began to see that courage was not just about survival. It was about sharing, about opening oneself to others, and about embracing the unfamiliar.
One night, as they sat around a small fire, one of the women spoke about the challenges of traveling through the desert. She described the fear, the exhaustion, and the uncertainty they had faced before arriving at John's ranch.
John nodded, realizing that their courage mirrored his own in many ways. He had faced isolation and hardship for years, and though it had been different, it required similar resilience.
The conversation deepened their connection, revealing that courage could be found in many forms, whether in a journey across the desert or in a life lived quietly but with intention. The women also shared lessons of compassion.
They explained how their families valued helping others, how every action could have meaning, and how respect for life, human, animal, and plant, was essential.
John listened, reflecting on his own life.
He had cared for his animals and land diligently, but he had rarely considered the wider meaning of those actions.
The women's perspective opened his eyes to a new understanding. That caring for life, no matter how small, was part of a larger story, a network of respect and responsibility that connected all living things. John, in turn, shared his own lessons. He spoke of patience, of the importance of paying attention to detail, and of learning from mistakes. He told them how the desert had taught him resilience, how solitude had taught him observation, and how responsibility for his land had taught him humility. The women listened with interest, asking questions, comparing his experiences to their own, and offering insights from their culture. The exchange was mutual, a balance of teaching and learning that strengthened their bond each day. As the days passed, the women grew confident in their surroundings. They learned to read the land, care for the animals, and navigate the routines of ranch life. John observed their growth with quiet pride, realizing that their resilience and curiosity were contagious. He found himself more patient, more thoughtful, and more open to experiences beyond his own limited world.
Their presence had become a catalyst, reminding him that life was richer when shared, and that the world, though harsh, could offer moments of beauty and connection even in unexpected ways. John also began to notice small personal changes.
He laughed more easily, spoke more freely, and even found himself anticipating their presence. Their energy, their questions, and their stories had filled a space in his life that he had not realized was empty. He felt a sense of purpose he had long forgotten, a quiet fulfillment that came from guiding, teaching, and connecting with others. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, not just existing in isolation, but participating in life with others. One evening, as they watched the stars together, the women spoke of their dreams for the future. They talked about returning to their village, about family, and about the life they hoped to build. John listened, feeling a deep respect for their courage and vision. He understood that their journey was only part of their story, and that he had played a small but meaningful role in it. In turn, he shared his own hopes, quiet ones, of connection, understanding, and perhaps a life less lonely. The conversation was gentle and thoughtful, a reflection of trust and mutual respect that had grown over days of shared experience. The bond between them deepened not through dramatic events but through small, meaningful acts. Sharing water, helping with chores, telling stories, laughing together, and watching the desert sky became rituals of connection.
John realized that these moments were teaching him about humanity, courage, and compassion in ways that solitude never could.
The women had brought a vitality to his life that he could not have anticipated, and he cherished the lessons they shared as much as the skills and knowledge he passed on to them.
By the end of the week, John and the women had developed a mutual understanding that went beyond words.
They respected each other's strengths, supported each other's weaknesses, and learned from each other's experiences. The desert, once a harsh and lonely place, had become a backdrop for growth, learning, and human connection. John understood that life had a rhythm that included both solitude and companionship, and that true courage and understanding often came from opening oneself to others. As the sun set on another day, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, John felt a quiet gratitude.
The women had arrived unexpectedly, challenging his solitude, teaching him lessons of culture, courage, and compassion. In return, he had offered them safety, knowledge, and care. Together, they had built a small community within the vastness of the desert, a place of learning, respect, and shared humanity. The connection they had formed was not loud or dramatic, but it was strong and enduring, rooted in mutual respect and shared experience. John sat on the porch that night, watching the fireflies flicker near the porch lights, listening to the soft breathing of the women asleep inside, and feeling a sense of peace he had never known before.
He had learned that life, even in the harshest conditions, could be beautiful when shared.
He had discovered that courage was found in many forms, that compassion could be taught and received, and that the bonds formed through trust and care were some of the strongest in life. The desert night stretched endlessly, full of stars and quiet sounds. John reflected on the journey so far, the sudden arrival of the women, the days of care and teaching, and the growth they had all experienced together. He realized that life had a way of bringing unexpected lessons, and that openness, trust, and shared effort could transform even the most solitary existence. In the stillness of the night, John felt a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of the world around him, ready for whatever the next day might bring. The morning light spilled across John's ranch in gentle streams of gold and pink. The desert was quiet, save for the soft sounds of animals stirring and the wind brushing over the hills. Today was different. John woke with a mixture of anticipation and melancholy. The three women were ready to continue their journey, and he knew that the quiet routine of his life would return. But it would never be the same. Over the past week, the women had become more than visitors. They had become a part of his life, and the thought of their departure filled him with a quiet ache he had not expected. Breakfast was simple, but this morning it carried an added weight. John prepared eggs, bread, and fresh water, placing the food carefully in front of the women. They ate in silence at first, each lost in thought. The bond they had formed over days of work, laughter, and stories had grown quietly but deeply. John watched them, noticing how strong they had become, how confident their steps were, and how easily they moved around the ranch. Their faces carried a new sense of resilience and hope. For a moment, John allowed himself to feel proud, not just of his role in their recovery, but of the way they had embraced life so fully, even after hardship. After breakfast, John helped them pack their belongings. Their bags were small, containing only what they needed for the journey ahead. They had learned to travel lightly, to carry only what was necessary, and John admired their practicality. The women moved with efficiency, yet there was a gentle sadness in their eyes. They had grown accustomed to the safety and care of the ranch, to the rhythm of shared life, and to the quiet but steady companionship of the man who had sheltered them. John walked with them to the edge of the property. He had never imagined that this moment would feel so significant. He had spent years alone, speaking mostly to animals and the land, and yet here he was, saying goodbye to three people who had transformed his world. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The desert stretched endlessly around them, wide and open, a reminder of both the freedom and the challenges that lay ahead.
One of the women stepped forward, her voice soft but steady.
"Thank you," she said, looking directly at John. "We could not have made it without you." "You saved our lives." John felt a lump in his throat. He nodded quietly, unable to find the words that would capture the depth of his own gratitude for having known them. In his years of solitude, he had never imagined that anyone would bring such warmth and life into his world. And yet, here they were, leaving behind memories that would remain with him forever. The women spoke briefly, sharing their plans for the journey ahead and promising to visit their families safely. They expressed hope that they might one day return to the ranch, not as survivors, but as friends. John listened, feeling the sincerity in their voices and the weight of the unspoken connection they had formed. It was a bond built not on obligation or convenience, but on trust, shared experience, and the quiet care they had offered each other over the past days. As they prepared to leave, John gave them a small gift, a map of the surrounding area with notes about water sources, paths, and places of safety. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of experience and concern. The women accepted it gratefully, folding it carefully into one of their bags.
John realized that this exchange, like so much else during their time together, was symbolic of the mutual respect and learning that had developed. They had taught him about courage, culture, and compassion, and he had offered them guidance, care, and safety. The women began to walk toward the distant trail that would lead them out of the desert. John watched their figures grow smaller against the vast landscape, the sunlight glinting off their hair and the folds of their clothing. Each step they took was a testament to their resilience, their strength, and the lessons they had absorbed during their time on the ranch. John felt a mixture of pride, sadness, and hope. He knew that life would return to its quiet routine, but the experience had changed him fundamentally. As the women disappeared over the horizon, John stood still, taking in the sight of the desert stretching endlessly before him. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for their presence, but for the way they had awakened him to a life beyond isolation. He realized that solitude had been comforting, but it had also been limiting. The women had reminded him that connection, trust, and care were essential parts of life, even in the most remote and challenging places. Returning to the ranch, John noticed small details with new appreciation. The fences, the animals, the plants, all had been part of a shared experience now. He tended to his chores with a renewed sense of purpose, reflecting on the lessons the women had brought. He thought about resilience, about courage, about the value of helping others, and about the quiet joy that comes from meaningful human connection. The desert, once a symbol of isolation, now felt like a place of learning and growth. John spent the following days quietly, but with a new awareness. He spoke more freely to the animals, he moved with more intention, and he allowed himself to remember the laughter and voices of the women. Each task he completed carried a sense of reflection and gratitude. Even simple things, feeding the horses, collecting water, tending to the garden, felt more significant, more connected to the larger world because he had shared them with others. In the evenings, John would sit on the porch and gaze at the stars, thinking of the women and their journey ahead. He imagined them safe with their families, recounting stories of the desert and the man who had helped them. He felt pride and hope, knowing that the lessons they had learned would stay with them, just as their presence would stay with him. The quiet night, once a symbol of solitude, now felt comforting and alive with memory and reflection. John began to consider the possibilities of his own life. He had spent years alone, believing that solitude was enough. Now he understood that connection, even brief or unexpected, could bring depth and meaning to life. He thought about welcoming visitors in the future, about helping others in need, and about allowing himself to form bonds without fear. The women had taught him courage in ways he had never anticipated, not just in surviving the desert, but in opening his heart to the world again. Days turned into weeks, and life on the ranch settled back into a quiet rhythm. But the memory of the women and the lessons they had shared remained with John. He continued his work, tending to animals, repairing fences, and observing the land, but there was a subtle change in everything he did. His movements were more intentional, his awareness more sensitive, and his heart more open. The desert, which had once been a backdrop for isolation, was now a place of reflection, growth, and remembrance. John occasionally looked toward the horizon where the women had left, imagining their journey and hoping for their safety. He felt a quiet connection to them that distance could not erase. Their brief time on his ranch had created a lasting impact, proof that human bonds, once formed, could endure even when separated by miles or circumstances. The desert, wide and vast, had not been able to diminish the lessons they had taught each other. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset, John smiled quietly to himself. He thought about the laughter, the work, and the stories shared. He remembered the moments of fear, the careful tending, and the slow building of trust. Each memory was a reminder of the power of kindness, courage, and human connection. He understood that life would continue, challenges would remain, but he was no longer the man who lived only in solitude. He was someone who had experienced the unexpected richness of shared life, and he would carry that forward in all he did. The nights that followed were calm, filled with the sounds of the desert, the soft rustle of grass, the distant calls of nocturnal birds, and the occasional whisper of wind across the hills. John felt a sense of peace, deeper than anything he had known before. The silence was no longer lonely. It was reflective, a space where he could honor the experiences shared and the lessons learned. He understood that life, even in the quietest and most remote places, was never truly solitary.
Connection, care, and courage could find their way even into the most isolated corners of the world. As weeks passed, John continued his work with a renewed sense of purpose.
The ranch thrived under his care, but now it was filled not just with animals and plants, but with memory and meaning. Every fence he repaired, every animal he fed, and every chore he completed carried a sense of shared experience. He had been transformed by the presence of the women. Their courage, resilience, and humanity had left a lasting impression. And in that quiet desert, John realized that life was richer, fuller, and more meaningful because of the bonds he had allowed himself to form.
Though the women had left, John carried their lessons with him every day. He knew that one day they might return or that others might find their way to his ranch, but for now he embraced the quiet with gratitude and reflection.
He understood that life's true value was not in isolation, but in the connections, care, and courage shared with others, even if only for a brief time. The desert stretched endlessly before him, vast and unforgiving, but now it felt like a place of hope, learning, and lasting transformation. John watched the stars that night, their light twinkling like a million small reminders of the world beyond his ranch. He smiled softly, feeling a quiet strength and a renewed sense of purpose. Life had changed in ways he could never have imagined, and he knew that the lessons of courage, trust, and human connection would stay with him forever. The desert, once a place of silence and solitude, had become a place of growth, understanding, and hope. And John, once a silent rancher, was no longer the same man who had opened his door to 3 strangers, one hot, desperate day.